The fateful Thursday of February of 24th of 2022 looked yearly like some scenes of, when great wars start and no one knows what could happen.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in US news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement and Impact at the United States Study Center. Thanks for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. 3 years ago, Russian troops invaded Ukraine with airstrikes and a ground invasion from the north towards Kyiv, the south from Crimea, and the east from the Donbass. Many expected Ukraine to have surrendered almost immediately and to give up significant territory to Russia. However, global allies quickly united to support Ukraine through providing weapons and to constrain Russia through severe sanctions. Now, the war has lingered on, and it is the most deadly conflict in Europe since the Second World War. President Trump is pushing for talks to end the war, and these are moving at a fast pace at the moment. But the focus has been primarily on improving the relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin. So what might peace look like in a negotiated treaty? Who benefits most from this outcome? And what message does this send to countries around the world? To discuss these questions, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Gorana Grgic back on the podcast. She's currently in residence as a senior researcher with the Swiss and Euro-Atlantic Security Team at the ETH Zurich Center for Security Studies. She was previously a Partners Across the Globe Research Fellow at the NATO Defense College. Welcome back on the podcast, Gorana.
Thank you so much.
And at the end of the podcast, we'll get your by the numbers stat, so make sure you stay tuned for that at the end. So just to start off, I guess, as we're looking back at this big milestone to reflect, can you set the stage for us about what led to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and why it was significant?
So this would require kind of a whole essay type response, but I'll try to be brief here. So what we need to highlight at the outset is that this invasion and the full-scale war that has ensued, and obviously that marks a 3-year anniversary these days, is not an abrupt shift, but rather the culmination of years of failed attempts to reassert Russian control over Ukraine. But if we were to distill it to a couple of key factors, I would say 3 are most prominent. 1, geopolitics, 2, ideology, and 3, the nature of the Russian regime. And what I mean by this is first that geopolitically, Russia has long viewed itself as a great power that's entitled to a sphere of influence over all of the post-Soviet area, and particularly Ukraine and Belarus. Although Moscow temporarily deprioritized these concerns and ambitions during the period of relatively good relations with the West, I would say, in the 1990s and early 2000s, it never accepted the idea that Ukraine would fully integrate into Western institutions. And so as Ukraine sought greater independence from Russian influence, Russia responded with economic pressure, with political coercion, and ultimately this is what precipitated its, first of all, annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass in 2014, and obviously that led to 2024 war. But then on the ideological front and the nature of the regime, we see that these 2 elements were always intimately tied to its geopolitical ambitions. Ideologically, Russia became more assertive in its foreign policy, and it at the same time developed an increasingly anti-Western ideological framework. This was most evident in Vladimir Putin's 2007 Munich Security Conference speech, where he framed NATO expansion as a provocation against Russia. And then If you think about it, the 2008 war with Georgia further underscored this willingness to use military force to maintain its influence in the region and again to assert itself, as I already mentioned, in 2013, 2014, during the time of Ukraine's Euromaidan protest, which led to the ousting of the then pro-Russian Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych. Finally, the nature of Russia's regime, we can't ignore the fact that basically as time passed, as Vladimir Putin basically asserted himself in power, Russia has become increasingly authoritarian, and especially so following the mass protests in 2011, 2012 that challenged the legitimacy of Putin as, again, re-elected president of Russian Federation. So what he has done from back then, but again, this has a long lineage already in early 2000s, but truly starts gaining more momentum, is tightening control over the media, suppressing any kind of dissent from opposition groups, from the civil society, and again, portraying himself as this sort of savior of the nation against Western-sponsored subversion, as a lot of the kind of Putin writings and those aligned him would suggest. So the justification then for war was framed in ideological terms, with Putin emphasizing historical and cultural unity between Russians and Ukrainians, and basically the way that, again, Russian regime would assert itself in basically providing for this unity of peoples, as he himself wrote in his 2021 famous essay.
I mean, there's so much to unpack there. It's really fascinating, and it sets us up well to understand some of the dynamics that are significant as peace talks are being negotiated, and how that plays out in these discussions. How much of Russia's identity on a global stage plays into that. When the war first started, it was expected it might be over pretty quickly because obviously Russia has far more military power than Ukraine does. But it has unfolded slowly with, I guess, some peaks and troughs over the 3 years that's been going on. How has the war kind of defied expectations from before it happened to now here we are? It's still going on to some extent, although peace talks are happening at the moment.
That's a great question. And I would just say that I still remember, and it will be hard to forget for as long as I'm alive, those days in late February of 2022. I was in Europe back then, and I recall that we were also having these discussions back around what all of this might mean for Europe, because that Thursday, the fateful Thursday of February of 24th of 2022, looked eerily like some scenes of when great wars start, and no one knows what could happen once these tanks roll and how things might unravel. But I think in the very early days, what the expectations were was that basically Russia would have the upper hand, and that it would be basically successful in swiftly deposing the Ukrainian government and assuming control over the entire country. So much so that I again recall that a lot of the observers, both from the Russian side but also from the West, expected Ukraine to potentially collapse by the end of that weekend, by February 27th, under the weight of a full-scale invasion. However, what has been one major sort of takeaway from these early expectations is that nothing, in terms of these early assessments, came true in terms of Russia's strategic objectives being fulfilled. That didn't happen, nor Ukrainian collapse as it was expected. Ukrainian people showed resilience and ability to withstand now nearly 3 years of intense warfare. And I would say this is the main takeaway from my end. And again, for Russia, instead of having a rapid victory, it has found itself engaged in a prolonged conflict, in a very costly war against a nation that not only resisted, but also has thus far been receiving significant military and economic support from the West. So I think that overall, in terms of defying the expectations, first of all, I would say that Vladimir Putin miscalculated Ukrainian resilience, as well as the international response. So Europe didn't prioritize economic interests over solidarity with Ukraine. And it's not like, this strategic partnership that Russia has struck with China has shielded it completely from the severe repercussions that we've seen over rounds and rounds of sanctions. But at the same time, I would say that as the West, or political West, if you wish, global West, collectively imposed various types of economic punishments as it provided military, economic, humanitarian aid to Ukraine, it has not been able to isolate Russia completely. And again, defying some of these expectations then that were brought about some of the successes on the battlefield on part of Ukraine, for instance, if we think about the counteroffensive of late 2022, early 23, Russia actually has been able to hold. There was no strategic defeat, right? And what we've seen is that Russia still stands economically, even if it is under significant strain. And this is owing to Beijing's support. This is also owing to support from some of the key pivotal and major global South states, India, who have provided basically this kind of lifeline in terms of importing a lot more of Russia's hydrocarbons. And also from countries like Iran and North Korea, which together with China and Russia, of course, form this kind of block of interlocking partnerships and have even supplied military aid. Iran with drones and North Korea even with sending troops, as we see these days in the Kursk region of Russia. And one final thing, what I would say in terms of at least the way that things stood up until the past couple of weeks, and we can discuss in a little bit how quickly things are changing. I think that the war has deepened some of these global alignments I've already alluded to in terms of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, but also something that has been particularly in focus of my own research, and that is the cooperation between democratic and like-minded nations across the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific. So what we've seen, even Australia, talking about the future of Ukraine being very important for what goes on in the Indo-Pacific. And this kind of linkage between the theaters is something that we haven't seen at any point before Ukraine war, pronounced maybe at the same level and with the same depth as we have. So things that have sprung out of this, various diplomatic and political initiatives like NATO and IP4, Indo-Pacific 4 cooperation with Japan, Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand is something that has been a significant, and I would say almost an unexpected consequence of this war.
Yeah, and from when the war first broke out, there was this huge kind of rallying effect among the transatlantic allies and partners coming together behind NATO. And then Russia was going it alone for a lot of it, but then it strengthened its ties with that bloc you talked about with, China, Iran, and North Korea. It's been fascinating to see how that's happened. And that's kind of been this growing trend over the 3 years. But as you mentioned, things have changed in the last couple weeks. And it now seems that on the transatlantic relationships, there's a change where the U.S. now, under President Trump's leadership, is starting to go a different direction. They're taking a different tone and a different approach. And so I'm keen to think about that a little bit, and then what European partners are doing in response. Because President Trump, in his campaign, he even, I think it was at one of the debates where he said he could end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. And he's made it a priority. And so he's been pushing this forward, and then just very recently, we've had the talks between Russian officials and U.S. officials with Secretary of State Marco Rubio meeting in Saudi Arabia. and talking about pathways forward, but there was no representation from Ukraine, no invite to Ukraine. Just quickly, is it normal to start negotiations for having, coming towards some sort of resolution like this? Is it normal to start with just talking to one country in a major way like that first? And then I guess from here, from what we're seeing and the messages we're getting, what might a pathway forward look like that might be resulting from these conversations that we're having?
Yeah, so you're right. It wasn't 24 hours necessarily. It was more like 28 days since the inauguration. But obviously, we've now seen the kind of base and just the kind of content of these talks between US and Russia really gain momentum in a way that a lot of people actually couldn't have expected necessarily in terms of what the makeup of some of these negotiation tables has looked like over the past couple of days. So, on your question on conflict termination and kind of mechanics, I guess, of negotiations for any kind of peace agreement, there is a school of thought which would say you need to basically simplify the kind of negotiations as much as possible, whether it's in the number of parties present or whether it's in the number of issues that are being discussed. Because if you try to bring all the possible stakeholders and all the possible issues, right, the chances that you're going to agree on something are becoming increasingly slim. So maybe to give kind of a benefit of a doubt there, there could be one kind of textbook approach that could fit what's going on. However, what I would say in this case is that the way that the present US administration has changed the US strategy and foreign policy in general towards Ukraine over just a couple of days looks more like an assertion of great power diplomacy, which raises serious concerns about Ukraine's sovereignty and agency, and also brings into question all of the transatlantic relationship, I would say, because ultimately Europeans, if they are asked to shoulder a lot more weight, which they have been doing over the past 3 years, it's not all as it seems to be portrayed, that they haven't done absolutely anything. We can also talk about that. Then the expectation would be that at least you would engage them around the table, especially because up until the past couple of weeks, again, US and European and Euro-Atlantic allies have been standing with Ukraine. So to shun them to the side and to actually reach out to the Russians with basically no preconditions for negotiation. And this is also something that can be put to a debate, whether, negotiations should be the goal or whether they are just an instrument, right? And how do you approach them? Do you approach them by actually not asking for any kinds of concessions from Russia, right? Because all the while these talks were going on in Riyadh, Russia kept on sending its drones and attacking targets in major cities across Ukraine, even Kiev, as that was going on Tuesday. And again, in that way, it truly is a precedent. But then, what I would say, to add a kind of layer of complexity to all of these things is that what we've seen happen in Saudi Arabia with the talks between U.S. Secretary of State Rubio, National Security Advisor Waltz, and the Middle Eastern envoy Witkoff on the American side, and then Foreign Minister of Russian Federation Lavrov and Putin's foreign policy advisor Ushakov, is that a lot of this engagement was mainly about US Russia reset, if you want to speak this kind of language, which is very familiar to all of the US Russia kind of relations observers, rather than necessarily Ukraine. Ukraine was one of the points on this agenda, but basically, a lot of what was discussed is. From what we've heard now from press releases and from the participants themselves talking to media, is that it was about normalizing relations with, so U.S. would normalize relations with Russia. There would be kind of reciprocal bringing back of diplomats into embassies, and then finding opportunities for economic exchange, for investment, and so on. Which again, at the moment when we do have a war going on, a full scale, largest warfare on European continent since the end of the Second World War, seems a little bit again sidelining Ukraine and what should be the main topic of discussion.
So it seems like, yeah, the U.S. is putting forward first this normalizing relations with Russia, and if that's the focus of the initial talks, and if Putin's motivations in this war were largely around the role of Russia on the global stage, then that would align with those two interests aligning for having conversation. But then, what does that mean for the European allies and partners who were also not at these talks and were not invited? And we've just had, the Munich Security Conference has just gone on, and there's been talk around Russia and Ukraine at that. So, how are European countries responding to this, and other world leaders? What is their response? What is their take, and their approach toward maybe next steps for Ukraine in light of these developments?
Yeah, well, European leaders have reacted with a lot of alarm and almost surprise. And then all of us who are observing this and who were saying all of these things, I think, from the moment that it was clear that Donald Trump would return to the White House, are just surprised that European leaders are surprised at all of this happening, right? That there wasn't a lot more of effort in this kind of interregnum period in the early weeks to actually have a worst case scenario and to assert themselves again, to make a point why it is that they need to be present, or why, for instance, there should be some sort of European Union envoy, whether this would be already an existing kind of institution, for instance, in the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security policy, this is Kaya Kallas, or someone else, who would speak for this interest, or because, of course, we have countries that really matter in these talks, but that aren't part of the European Union. And I'm speaking of United Kingdom most prominently, which has actually taken on a large coordination role from the United States because of this kind of Trump-proofing effort that was already going on under the Biden administration to basically agree who would speak for the European interests. So, of course, there was a lot of alarm and consternation. This is why French President Macron summoned this extraordinary meeting at the Elysee on Monday. And we had representatives of what was referred to as the main European states, from France, Germany, Britain, Italy, Poland, Spain, Netherlands, Denmark, and also with the presence of the EU and NATO leadership. And I have to tell you, as I'm sitting in Europe, this has already added to some of the existing divisions within Europe. First of all, in terms of the participants list, where some of the smaller states said, why is it that only you guys get a say, right? And this is not a great moment to be discussing, again, who is at the table and so on. But, again, exposing the fact that Europeans have a very difficult time coming to an agreement when it comes to foreign and security policy consensus, especially because there are certain states, again, within the European Union who don't necessarily agree on the path of supporting Ukraine, right? The likes of Orban's Hungary, or what we see with Fico in Slovakia and so on. But then even if we brush that aside, right, and if we just focus on the contents of the talks in Paris over the past couple of days, we have seen that disagreements persist over things like troop deployments, strategies towards peace negotiation, kind of how do you actually conduct diplomacy, and how to actually respond to Washington's unilateral pushes and this kind of effort to strike a great power deal with Russia. So this has just intensified frustration among European policymakers with what's going on in DC, but also it has highlighted there are divisions. And I would say, over troop deployments, I think this is something, even if we get to a durable peace deal, who is going to commit, under what sort of circumstances? We've seen some countries being willing to do so. UK has underscored that. France has already been touting that for quite some time. But others have basically drawn a red line and they don't even want to discuss it at this point. And this was very obvious from the current and probably outgoing German Chancellor Scholz, who has said that Germany doesn't even want to entertain these discussions at the moment.
Hmm. Wow. So even divisions among the European allies. So we're seeing a fracturing happening, which makes me think of something we have talked about on the podcast before, is the fact that Ukraine so desperately wants to become part of NATO. And so this is something that's been talked about, and with the NATO summits, would there be a pathway? And it can't happen while the war is going on because of the clause that says that if there's an attack on any NATO member nation, then they all would join in defending that country. But it was always an option maybe after the war, something that's been talked about. But now the new U.S. Defense Minister, Pete Hegseth, recently said that this wouldn't happen. What factors do you think would play into determining whether Ukraine can join NATO or not? And what outcome do you think would be most likely at this stage? Or is it just a toss-up?
Yeah, and I mean, again, you and I have recorded these podcasts at the kind of heels of the summit in Vilnius in 2023, then Washington just last year. And for all that time, there was this sort of talk that there would be a path for Ukraine, right? Even last year, as recently as last year, Ukraine was said to be on an irreversible path towards NATO membership. Of course, everything that you just said, everything that we've heard over the past week seems to counter that, because, of course, while Article 10 of the North Atlantic Treaty allows and provides for any European state that can contribute to North Atlantic or Euro-Atlantic security to apply, of course, this NATO NATO membership aspiration requires unanimous approval, so consensus from all existing members of the NATO alliance. And of course, it includes a complex and lengthy process actually to ratify this in all of the legislatures of now 32 allied states. But even if you have one that disagrees, as we've heard now, this would be United States in this case, the potential for full membership is a no-go. What does this mean? Well, now I think we are in a territory where increasingly, when it comes to Ukrainian aspirations in terms of its Euro-Atlantic integrations, and this doesn't just include NATO, but also the European Union, we are talking a lot more about some of these stopgap kind of solutions and ways that Ukraine could, for at least some time, contrary to what it expressly desires, again, Ukraine has made it very clear how it sees itself. Ukrainian government, Ukrainian people want to be part of the European Union, want to be, again, majorities want to be part of NATO. We see that poll after poll. But of course, again, if from that receiving end there is no consensus or there is an inability to actually enact this, there will need to be other potential solutions for Ukraine's security needs and overall where it would fit in the broader European security architecture. So I think what we've now heard being tossed around, and this again will have to be part of the peace agreement negotiations, is either the option of having very credible security guarantees, and Ukraine has struck over a dozen of such arrangements with individual European countries around basically how they could provide for Ukraine's security, and again, how they could guarantee the terms of the peace agreement and act basically as some sort of deterrent versus Russia, right? But again, without the United States, which we've heard now from the US administration being unwilling and really uninterested in providing any troops on the ground or having any kind of NATO flagged peacekeeping operation in Ukraine. So this will, of course, bring the credibility of such guarantees into question if they are solely from European countries where we only have the two remaining having that kind of nuclear arsenal that could be, bigger and kind of more credible deterrent factor for Russia. But again, nothing that compares to what United States provides with its security umbrella. Or the other option, which now is being thrown around, is this idea of armed neutrality, that basically Ukraine would abandon its NATO ambitions, that it wouldn't seek security guarantees, but basically would commit to some sort of non-aligned status and at the same time basically fortify its defenses to make it look like some sort of European porcupine, right? Um, Again, this would be problematic, I would say, down the line, because what Russia is trying to do in all of these negotiations is trying to push forward the idea of full demilitarization of Ukraine rather than having a porcupine Ukraine on its borders. So it's really messy, but basically now at the moment, it's very hard to see which of these options will prevail, simply because of the kind of unpredictability of the peace negotiations or any kind of peace agreement that will be struck, because we are not privy to any of those sort of details at the moment.
Yeah. So you've touched on this a little bit in terms of if Ukraine wants lasting security either through NATO membership or maybe some other form of security arrangement. Russia wants Ukraine demilitarized. What does each country? What are they trying to get out of these negotiations to end the conflict? What would they be seeking to get?
Well, it's clear that neither side at the moment is likely to achieve maximalist goals, right? Moscow, at least at the moment, is not going to be able to overthrow the Ukrainian government and install some sort of puppet regime, even though what we've seen actually from the talks in Riyadh is at least what has been reported, a push towards Ukraine holding elections, and then a lot of questions being raised about the integrity of those, especially in terms of Russia's ability or at least attempts to subvert the democratic process in Ukraine. But of course, on Kiev's side, what we know would be the goals is to reinstitute control over all of its territory, which is something now that the U.S. administration is saying that it sees it as something that's impossible. So as things currently stand, I would say Russia is at the moment able to set the agenda, to dictate the terms of the negotiations, largely because Ukraine has been excluded thus far, and therefore it has more to benefit if the proposed sort of settlement terms are accepted, simply because it has had this first mover advantage. For Ukraine, a peace agreement that would result in partition of territories that are currently under Russian controls and the loss of any kind of prospects of Euro-Atlantic integration, uh, would be very hard for Zelensky and for the Ukrainian government overall to sell as anything uh, other than a strategic defeat, despite what the immediate cessation of hostilities and violence could bring about. So the way that things stand, and if a deal is structured in a way that cements Russia's gains and reinforces the sort of notion that military aggression actually can yield some political dividends, is something that is worrying for the rest of the world, but most importantly for Ukraine, because it is something that will have a long-term impact on its sovereignty and security.
And if we're approaching the end of this war, what sort of lessons can countries around the world take from this? And what does this whole, episode in global history, what does that signal to other revanchist powers around the world?
One stark takeaway, I would say, is that if we had any doubts before, we certainly don't have them now. And that is that in a world where nuclear weapons and large standing armies remain the ultimate deterrence, smaller states without such capabilities face significant challenges in resisting aggression from revisionist powers. And this is something that we thought was not necessarily the case when all of the institutions and sort of norms and regimes were of the post World War II, and especially of post Cold War era, were being drawn. But it seems that this is one of these critical lessons if things go the way that they are going, at least these days. Um, if I was to be optimistic at the same time, or at least try to find some hope, it would be that if a country has a strong sense of national identity and invests in its resilience and is able to mobilize international support, it is able to defy some of these expectations that we discussed before and actually sustain resistance for much longer than anticipated, even in the face of facing a nuclear power with capability of mobilizing hundreds of thousands of troops at almost a moment's notice. That's on the strategic level. And then if we go into some tactical and operational insights, I think what countries around the world have been learning as this war has been going on is how basically we live at a time when we have such advances in terms of the instruments of war, in terms of the types of armaments that are being used, but they are at the same time very much in use, combined with some of these older sort of systems, and that we can't necessarily say that we are fighting, the wars of the future, because at the same time, where Ukraine has been quite skillful in drone production, in actually now AI-driven warfare, in cyber warfare, we still know that it is important to have that kind of mass to fight, right? That tanks matter, right? That actually having enough ammunition matters, that basically we still have this trench-style combat that is reminiscent of World War I, that exists and coexists, right, with kind of cyber aspects and dimension of warfare. And I would also add one more thing, which has been very much underscored by Russia's war against Ukraine, and that is that private sector actors are becoming a lot more powerful and important in the conduct of warfare. And I think examples like Starlink satellite communications, for instance. So the role again that Elon Musk has these days, not just as the kind of secretary of Doge over in the United States, but also as an entrepreneur, as an owner of this company that provides vital communications infrastructure, is going to be hugely important in modern conflicts moving forward.
I think those are some fascinating takeaways. I guess just before I let you go, I'd love to get your by the numbers stat. What do you have for us today?
Well, my stat for today comes from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, which has said this famous Ukraine aid tracker. It has been publishing it basically from the early months of the war. And obviously, with February 24th marking the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they have aggregated some numbers. And what I found particularly interesting in this total, where they said that about 267 billion euros has been provided to Ukraine over the past 3 years. They have disaggregated what Europe has given versus the United States. So here are my numbers. Europe as a whole has overtaken the US in terms of Ukraine aid in total. So Europe has allocated 70 billion euros in financial and humanitarian aid, as well as 62 billion in military aid. This compares to 64 billion in military aid from the US, as well as 50 billion in financial and humanitarian allocation. So, and this is just to note that the Europe here is aggregated as all the EU members plus the institutions of the European Union, including, along with them, Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom, out of which obviously 3 of these 4 are also member states of NATO. So what I would say is that we also have to keep this in mind whenever we hear these charges that Europeans on the whole are not doing enough, or that US has shouldered most of the burden. Actually, the numbers here are quite stark, and it is quite clear that Europe on the whole has been giving a lot more, and this trend the kind of gap has started widening over the course of 2024.
Wow, those are fascinating trends to see. And it'll be interesting to see how these kind of different moving pieces, these trajectories go moving forward from here. But really fascinating. Great to get your insights as always. And just as we wrap up the podcast, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that might be of interest to our listeners. So our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, is co-host of the Asia Chessboard podcast with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I'd also recommend checking out our USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including all of our election events from last year. You can find these on our website at ussc.edu.au or wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, Grana, thank you so much for joining us. Really heavy topic, but I always, when I talk to you about these things, it gives me context that I find really helpful in these times. So thank you so much for coming on again.